Good. Well, lovely to be with you again this evening. We're continuing this series on apologetics that I started with you a few weeks back. Just to remind you about what we had looked at in that previous session. In our first session, we had looked at an apology for apologetics, where again, the word apologetics does not mean that we are apologizing for something. It means the word simply means a defense. So it's a defense of Christianity, and so I was giving a defense for doing a defense of Christianity. And looking at really the passage in 1 Peter 3, where Peter encourages us to be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks us a reason for the hope that is within us. We looked at various different approaches to apologetics and ended by reminding ourselves that we don't go out alone. Our responsibility is to share the message, but it is God who will open hearts, open minds, and we just need to be faithful in doing what he calls us to do. This evening we're going to look at the question of understanding worldviews. I'll explain that a little bit more in just a minute. Next time, hopefully we'll look at the existence of God, then the reliability of Scripture and the resurrection of Christ. And I did say that I would be open to suggestions if there's anything else you think that we should cover on that. So this evening, understanding worldview. So we're going to begin by looking at Acts chapter 17. Acts chapter 17. And again, you're probably very familiar with this passage. We're not going to look at it in great depth, but I just want to again set the scene and let you see that there is a good, again, biblical basis for what we are talking about here this evening. Paul has been traveling through Asia. He has gone now into Europe, and he has finally arrived in Athens in chapter 17. And in Athens, he goes around and he sees all of these idols to all of these different gods, and then he sees that there is this idol to an unknown God. And so he's given an opportunity. People are wondering about this preaching that he's been doing. They're asking him about the questions. It seems from what he's been saying, he's been talking about Jesus and the resurrection, and they want to know what these new ideas are. And it seems to be that they were thinking that Jesus was some kind of a new God, and that the word resurrection in Greek is anastasis, and they thought that this was some female goddess that he was talking about, and that they wanted to know more about it. And so Paul is given an opportunity to explain to them what he's talking about. And so he says in verse 22, "Then Paul stood up in the midst of the Areopagus and said, 'Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, him I proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to all life, breath, and all things. And he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, for so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as also some of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something shaped by art and man's devising. Truly these times of ignorance God overlooked, but now commands all men everywhere to repent, because he has appointed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by the man whom he has ordained. He has given assurance of this to all by raising him from the dead. And when they heard the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, while others said, 'We will hear you again on this matter.' So Paul departed from among them. However, some men joined him and believed, among them Dionysius the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them." And we trust that God will bless his word. So, what do we mean by a worldview? Let me give you a definition here. It is the lens through which we filter and interpret the world around us. And everybody does that. No matter who we are, everybody has a worldview. Most people don't determine their worldview or their philosophy of life through a process of careful reasoning, but they absorb it from their culture. So sometimes that's going to be from their families, their educational system, or religion. In the Western world, it is often subtly received from the media and entertainment. So again, people who are going to grow up in Saudi Arabia are going to have a different worldview than people who grow up in Ireland. But the reality is that people's worldview in Ireland are changing. The worldview that was around when you were youngsters is no longer there. There are changing worldviews, and we need to understand that that change is taking place. Not everyone knows that they have a worldview or can verbalize it, but they have one nonetheless, and it impacts how they live their lives. Now, there's a book that I've been looking at called Understanding the Times, and one of the things that he goes through, I think, like 10 different areas, and he says your worldview, it's going to impact your politics, it's going to impact your view of economics, it's going to impact your view of history, it's going to impact your view of truth. Everything is impacted by how you view the world around you. And a lot of people actually have very inconsistent worldviews. We are living in a time where people are picking and choosing what they like based on what they like, rather than having some coherent system of approaching life. And at the end of the day, it doesn't really work. And again, what I want to try and show is that Christianity provides for us the most solid and satisfying approach to viewing the world, and that makes sense of everything that we see around us. So why are worldviews important? Well, a worldview, this is a quote from this book, Understanding the Times, a worldview answers fundamental questions such as, why are we here? What is the meaning and purpose of life? Is there a difference between right and wrong? Is there a God? We all develop ideas in our attempt to answer these questions, and our ideas naturally give rise to a system of beliefs that become the basis for our decisions and actions. Our worldview is like a map. It helps us know where we are, where we need to go, and the best route to get them there. And I think that our challenge as Christians, as we talk with people, as we share the gospel with people, is to encourage them to question their worldview and to demonstrate that Christianity offers a superior worldview. Now, again, there are several different approaches and summaries. I'm just going to give you these very quickly. This book, Understanding the Times, he suggests that the major worldviews are Christianity, Islam, New Atheism, secularism, Marxism, and postmodernism. So he has 6 major worldviews that he considers in his book. Again, Christianity we know about, and when we're talking about Christianity, he's viewing Christianity in its broadest possible sense. And most of the people that are probably 40 and above, most of those people, even if they are not Christians, probably the majority of them in Ireland still have a Christian worldview. They look at things through that view of understanding that there is a creator God who made them, and they understand that there is an absolute basis for morality and for truth. Most people in that older generation would still look at it that way. But a lot of younger people today are probably looking at it through the views of New Atheism, secularism, or postmodernism. Now, New Atheism, again, you've heard about a lot of these New Atheists and their very outspoken, harsh words that they speak against Christianity. But again, to me, ultimately, it is an unsatisfying view because it doesn't answer all the big fundamental questions that we're looking for answers to. And postmodernism, to me, is just nonsensical because it's basically saying is that as soon as I try and tell you anything, as soon as I try and make an authoritative statement, I'm trying to control you, and so they reject that. But of course they are making an absolute statement and saying that there is no such thing as truth, and I'm trying to control you by the words that I'm saying. So it really becomes a self-defeating argument in that. Norman Geisler, in his book on apologetics, he has theism, deism, atheism, pantheism, panentheism, and polytheism as the major worldviews. Now, I cannot for the life of me understand what panentheism is, and I've never talked to anyone who holds to that view, so you probably don't need to worry too much about that. Theism basically is the idea that there is a God. Deism is the idea that God made the world and then abandoned it and we are still operating in a closed system, and God is not actively involved in the world or communicating with us. Atheism denies the reality of God. Pantheism is much more an Eastern philosophy where everything is God, and so you don't want to step on an ant because you're stepping on God, and it's all part of one big thing. And polytheism, again, parts of Hinduism, where they worship millions of God, would be polytheistic in its approach. So many of these worldviews are still relevant in the world today. And I guess my point is, if you are going as a missionary to parts of India, you would need to understand Hinduism to present the gospel effectively to Hindus. And if you were going to a majority Muslim country, you would need to understand Islam well to be able to explain the gospel, the unchanging gospel, but in a way that's going to make sense to them. So understanding that different people have different ways of viewing reality and of viewing the world and of thinking about where we came from and where we're going, we need to try and understand what their worldview is, and then again from our worldview try and show them why Christianity is true and why Jesus is the only answer for them. Now, for us to respond, I think, to worldviews, we first of all need to distinguish the audience. And that's why I read that passage from Acts chapter 17. In Acts chapter 2, on the day of Pentecost, Peter is talking to Jewish people. They share his worldview. And so he's able to talk to them about God. He's able to talk to them about the scriptures. He's able to quote the scriptures. They know the scriptures. He's able to show them that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of these prophecies of the coming Messiah. And we see right throughout the book of Acts, Peter and Paul both going into synagogues and reasoning with the Jews from the scriptures. They had a common source of authority that they could agree on. But in Acts chapter 17, the passage that we read together, when he comes to Athens, some of them were polytheistic because they have all of these altars to these various gods. We also know that they would have believed in Zeus and Hermes and all of these different Greek gods that they would have had on Mount Olympus. They were also the great schools of philosophy. Paul is addressing Epicureans and Stoics as he's speaking on Mars Hill on the Areopagus. And so very different approaches to life. And Paul takes a very different approach in speaking to them, but he still comes to the same end point. And I think that's the important thing. He begins at a different point, but he ends at the same point. And so in our approach to people, we are going to have to try and figure out what their worldview is, and then make sure that we can bring them from where they are to see what the gospel is actually teaching. And again, I know that some of you have had contact with Muslims and talking with them. They have a very different worldview. If you're regularly talking with Muslims, you'll need to find out a little bit more about their worldview. I'm not going to try and explain their worldview. I don't know it well enough myself to explain it. But I think we need to understand, who am I talking to? If we are talking to young atheists, we need to understand, how do I approach them? But we still need to get to that same point. So where Paul begins in Athens is he says, you're worshiping all of these gods and even an unknown God, and they're actually showing how superstitious they are, that they don't want to miss anyone out and cause offense and get in trouble with some God who they've not been worshipping properly. And so they've got one just to cover all the bases to the unknown God. But Paul uses that as a launching pad, and he says, let me tell you who that unknown God is. He's the God of all creation. He's the Lord of heaven and earth. He is your creator, and one day you're going to have to give an answer to him. And he said he is given assurance of this by raising Jesus from the dead. So he's begun with creation. He's moved to accountability and judgment. And he's moved to the resurrection of Jesus Christ, one of the great apologetic tools that we have. And so he's moved through that process and told them that one day they're going to have to give an account for their lives. So we need to be able to try and think about, how can we, in the people that we're speaking to, if you're speaking to someone who shares your worldview, it's a lot easier. When someone doesn't share your worldview, you've got to work a little bit harder to try and understand where they are coming from so we can bring the gospel to them. And now I say, if we are talking with someone who is a Catholic and a devout Catholic, someone who still accepts the authority of scriptures, at least in word, we at least have a similar starting point. Now, we might need to correct some of their theology and show them where the truth is and how they've misunderstood things and how human tradition has been added. But we have a common view. There's a common starting point that we can begin with. But if we're talking to an atheist or a secularist, we've got to go all the way back to creation and work from that point forward. So these are the fundamental questions that I think that we need to think about. I need to think about. These are the ones that I want to try and, for myself, have answers to. And again, I'm going to try and provide answers to these tonight from a Christian worldview. Again, I'm not going to look at all of the other worldviews. Again, we need to begin with the truth of what we believe and make sure that we can stand firmly on that. But then I think we can legitimately ask other people who have a different worldview, how do you answer these questions? Because I think these are questions of the heart. These are the questions that people are thinking about deep down. In one sense, they are philosophical questions about who we are and why we're here. So we want to think about the question of origins. Where did everything come from? The question of meaning. Why am I here? Does my life make any difference? The question of evil. Why is there so much suffering in the world? The question of morality. Why should I be good? Is there any benefit or not in me being good? And the question of destiny. What happens when I die? I think that Christianity provides solid answers to those heart questions that people are asking. And I have often said that one of the things that I appreciate about Christianity is that it satisfies my head and my heart. That it satisfies my heart, but I don't have to give up my head and have just a blind leap of faith into the dark. I think that there are good, rational reasons that can stand up to scrutiny as we talk with people in the world. So let's walk through these quite quickly. This is, again, something that I find helpful, is to think about these tests for truth, that I think that we probably unconsciously filter everything that we come through against these. So the first question is it logical? That is, does it make sense? In any particular thing, if you pick up a newspaper and you start reading the newspaper, or if you hear somebody telling you a story, and if it doesn't make any sense, you're immediately saying, that's not true. It just doesn't work. If I told you that as I was coming down the road here, I saw a pink elephant walking down the road, you would think, okay, this guy's had some funny medicine, or else there's a circus that's come to town or something, but that doesn't normally happen to see that. And so when something doesn't ring true in our mind, then there's probably a good reason for that. We expect things to make sense in this world. One of a child's favorite questions is why. They always want to know why. They want to understand. I remember talking with a lady here in Kilkenny one time, and it was a day I was knocking on doors and nobody wanted to talk to me, and this lady finally was willing to talk to me, and she told me that when she was a child in school, she used to get her knuckles rapped all the time because she asked too many questions, and she was told, you just need to have faith like a child and just believe. And I said to her, well, nobody asks more questions than a child. A child wants to understand. That's how they learn. And so we should be asking those why questions. And so even again from Christianity, we don't want it just to be a blind acceptance of something that the preacher says. Again, I'm going to stand on the authority of God's word. But even that, we need to say, is the Bible a reliable source of truth for us to base things on? And so the principle of logic must be applied to the Bible and to every other experience that we have in life. Then the second question, I think, for a test for truth, is it consistent? That is, does it contradict itself? One of the common objections against Christianity is that the Bible is full of contradictions. And if that were indeed true, then the Bible couldn't be true. Because if it's contradictory, then it's wrong. Now again, we need to look carefully when we're looking at the Bible, and I think sometimes people find contradictions because they want to find contradictions, but I think if we are willing to say, maybe there's something that I'm not understanding in this, then I have to work a little harder to find out how it all makes sense together. But if it is from a single author, God, who knows all things, then we should be able to find a satisfying answer to any possible contradictions between what we see. And then, is it verifiable? That is, can I check it out against other known truths? So I think, again, the Bible, unlike many other religious writings, particularly Eastern writings. So many of them are metaphysical writings, and there's nothing that you can verify. I often tell the story, there's a guy, Hugh Ross. I wouldn't agree with some of what he teaches, but Hugh Ross is an astrophysicist, and he talks about when he was growing up. He said he grew up in a godless home in Canada. No religion of any kind was taught or practiced by his parents or anybody in his family. And yet as he came into his later teen years, he realized that there had to be more to life than just physics and chemistry, just in the things that he could physically see with his eyes. And he said he wanted to explore religion and find out. And so he said he began with a lot of these Eastern Hindu Vedas and all of these different types of things to try. And he was so frustrated trying to read them because there was nothing that he could check out, nothing that he could verify. It was all this esoteric stuff that you just had to accept. And when he came to the Bible, he said he intentionally left the Bible till last because he suspected that this is where the truth was, but he wanted to begin with the others. And when he came to the Bible and he started reading about people and places and events in history that he could verify by archaeology and geography and science, he says the things that he could check out, did check out, and gave him confidence to believe the things that he couldn't check out. There are things in the Bible we have to take by faith because we've not seen them. And yet, because of those other confirmations of the truth of them, things again like Bible prophecy and things like that give us such great confirmation, he was willing to go forward on that basis. So let's look at the Christian worldview, answering these fundamental questions. And again, I know this is probably far too small for any of you to read, but I can read it on my screen and I'll tell you what it says. So the first question is the question of origins. Where did everything come from? And again, that's a normal question to ask. There are lots of useful things in this room. The chairs that you're sitting on, a guitar, a projector, a computer, a book, phones. And whenever you see something that is useful and functional and intricate in its design, you're having to say, who made that? Even when you hand a tract to somebody, the first thing that they're going to do is turn it over on the back and see where it came from. Because they know that that's not just some random thing that has happened. And so when we think about everything that we see around us, this question of origins, we want to find an adequate explanation of origins that will not only explain matter and energy, the basic building blocks of the physical world, but also life and information and intelligence and morality and personality and meaning. Where did all of these things come from? Now, obviously, atheism is going to tell us that everything is just a random accident. But how does a random explosion billions of years ago create intelligence, information, life, personality, and meaning? It really does not exist. An honest atheist, the new atheist, people like Richard Dawkins, would tell you that all of those things are just an illusion. That there is no real thing such as morality or meaning or intelligence. It's all just random. It's all just an accident. And that's not a very satisfying answer to my head or to my heart to hear that kind of response. Logic demands that the cause of matter must be immaterial because matter is not eternal. Science has proved that. Matter is not eternal, and it's winding down, and the process of entropy is ongoing. And so everything is going to run down. The clock has been wound up, and it's running down. And eventually, even according to our best atheistic scientists, they're telling us the point will come where everything will just fizzle out and nothing more will exist. So in order for matter to have come into existence in the beginning, it had to have been something immaterial that made matter. Because if it was matter that made matter, then you'd have to say, where did the matter come from? So there has to be something outside of the physical world to have created the physical world. Since our universe is composed of such incredible energy, the cause of our universe must be exceedingly powerful. There had to have been a lot of energy to create this world. The cause of life must have been living. A dead thing, an inanimate object, couldn't create life. So there must have been a being who had life, who gave life to this world. the cause of information, and everything is information. Your body is full of DNA. They say that a single strand of your DNA, all of the information in it, would fill a stack of books of encyclopedia. There is so much information in your DNA. It's all information that needs to be read and gives instructions to your body on how to build your cells and proteins and everything that functions in our body. So that information, where did that information come from? And it not only had to have information, but a mechanism to interpret and understand that information so that it was usable. The cause of personality must be personal. The cause of morality must be moral. And so again, that is really the way that the Bible describes God. A book that was written thousands of years ago, telling us, before we understood all about the scientific world and how it operates, it makes sense to me of the world in which we live. Then we want to move on to the question of meaning. If we are simply the byproduct of a cosmic accident and unguided random chances, then any appearance of meaning is actually just an illusion. And again, that's what this growing popularity of atheism, again, because it's giving people a mechanism by which they can reject God. They like that idea. It's becoming very, very popular, and we need to be ready to answer those kinds of questions. But the Bible teaches us that God created us for a purpose, that there is meaning in our life. Why did God create us? He created us for relationship. Again, I think it's one of the great truths, again, where I would see Christianity as so much superior to Islam, is that Islam believes in a solitary God, a God who is one, a God who is one with no variation within him. He's a pure singularity in their minds. But the Bible teaches a triune God who eternally existed in relationship. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. And in that beginning sentence of John chapter 1, with God is a word of relationship. That the Word had a relationship with God, but then it also tells us that the Word was God. So there is distinguishing and relationship, but also sameness found in that word. And so God created us because he was a relational being, because he, in his essence, is love. That's not something that a Muslim is going to tell you, that God is love. That is a Christian doctrine, that God is love, a loving God who loves us and wants to draw us into relationship with himself. And that's a beautiful thing. And that's why for us, the things that are most important in our lives are family, friends, relationships that we have. It's often been said that nobody on their deathbed is going to say, I wish I spent more time in the office. I wish I'd spent more time at work. They're going to say, I wish I spent more time with my family, with my children, because we know deep down that that's what is most important. That's what's most valuable. So God created us for a relationship with himself, and because we are relational beings, we want to have relationships with others as well. But God also created us to worship and serve him. And again, that's a wonderful truth. I've been thinking a lot about that because I remember someone here asking me this question many years ago, and I struggled with an answer at the time, and I've continued to struggle on it. Is God insecure in that he calls for us to worship him? Does he feel that if we don't tell him how good he is, that he's going to feel bad about himself? Or why does God want us to worship him? But I think that the reality is, two things I would say about it. First, we become like what we worship. And so those who worship idols become like the idols that they worship. And God doesn't want that to happen. That was the problem that Israel had when they started going after the gods of the nations around them. They became like them. But I think also when we learn to give God his rightful place, everything else in life falls into place. If we understand who God is and who I am in relationship to him, then everything else in life makes sense. Again, the story is told about this thief who broke into a department store, I think it was in Philadelphia, and he didn't steal anything. But he went all through the shop changing the price tags on everything. And so the things that were very valuable, he put a price tag that was very low, and everything that was very cheap, he put big price tags on. And the value of everything was flipped upside down. And the world in which we live is putting value on all the wrong things. But when we put God in his rightful place, when we understand who he is, and when we worship him, then to me everything else makes sense in this world. So we need to give God his rightful place in his life. But he's also called us to serve him. And that's not a curse, that's a blessing. That we have an opportunity to contribute something meaningful. Again, it's important to remember that work is not part of the curse. Work was given to mankind before the curse came in. That God gave responsibility. Because we gain our sense, and I was going to say particularly men, but I think women as well, we gain our sense of worth from the things that we do. That's why so often when you meet someone, you ask, what do you do? You want to find out about their job, their career, because you understand something about them by the things that they do. And so God has entrusted us with the opportunity to serve him, to do something meaningful, so that our life has meaning, so that it has purpose. I talk with people. There's a man I know, and he hasn't worked for years. He has no reason to get up in the morning. He sleeps all sorts of weird hours because of that, and his life is just a mess. But when you have structure to your life, when you have a reason to get up and something to do, and when you're able to see something fruitful coming from your life, then you understand that there is purpose and meaning to your life, and you are contributing to society. But he also called us to be his representatives on earth. Again, I think that's part of the idea, not exclusively, but part of the idea when it tells us that we were made in the image of God. They tell us that back in the times when Genesis was written by Moses, that when a king would capture a territory, he would set up his image in that territory to claim ownership over it. And say, I'm going to put my statue there, and you need to honor my statue in that place. Well, we are God's image, and he has placed us as his representatives of God here in this world. And he gave to Adam and Eve the responsibility of dominion over the world. As his representatives, we are God's co-regents to reign with him, and man failed, and Christ was incarnate, so that one day a man will rule this world again in the way that God intended it to be. So, third question, the question of evil. Again, this is an interesting one because there are a lot of people who reject Christianity because of the problem of evil. But it doesn't do away with the problem. And Norman Geisler points out that every worldview, no matter whether you're an atheist or a pantheist, you still need to give some answer to the problem of evil and suffering because it's everywhere. He says pantheism affirms God but denies evil. It says that evil is just an illusion. That's what you would find in Hinduism. But atheism, it affirms evil but denies God, and Christianity or theism affirms God and evil. We recognize. And so again, it is taking the reality that we see around us seriously. It's not just saying it's an illusion. Atheism, in a sense, is saying that the apparent design that we see and all the things about cause and effect and morality, they're just saying that's an illusion, it's not real. Whereas Christianity is taking seriously the fact that there is a God and that evil is a real problem that we have to wrestle with. But the existence of evil assumes a moral law. And the existence of a moral law assumes that there is a moral lawgiver, and the Bible presents God as the standard and the judge of righteousness. He is the one who determines what is right and wrong. He is the standard. That's why it says in Romans chapter 6 that, Romans, I always get these mixed up, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The glory of God is the standard, and we're all falling short of that standard. The standard is God himself. And so any failure to live up to God's perfect standard is sin. So why do we see evil in the world? It's because God granted us the freedom to choose between good and evil. He didn't make us simply robots who had to do right all the time. He gave us a legitimate choice. He set before Adam and Eve. Again, I missed this for a long time in my reading of Genesis 1 and 2. You read through Genesis 1 and 2, and it is good, it is good, it is good. He makes man. He says it's very good. And then you go into chapter 2, and it kind of retells the story again of creation. And it tells us that this was a wonderful world that God had created. That there was gold, good gold in that land. That there was a spring from which 4 rivers came out. And there were all of these trees full of fruit. Everything was good. Everything God had provided for them. And God just said, there's just one tree I don't want you to eat from. Was there something magical? Was there something poisonous about that tree? It was a test. It was a question. I'm just going to give you one test. Will you obey me or will you disobey me? And when man disobeyed, sin entered into the world. But the temptation came in, and again, the 2 issues that Satan was tempting with is, first of all, did God really say? Can we trust what God said? And secondly, is God really good? He says that he's good, but he's taken away, he's holding something back on you. And so they gave into that temptation, sin entered the world, and all of the evil that we see in this world, all of the suffering, all of the heartaches that we experience in the natural world and the evil of men to men can be traced back to that entrance of sin into the world. Now, again, I know that there are atheists who are going to not like that explanation, but I think it is a real explanation, a powerful explanation. And not only is it that it explains the problem of evil, but it tells us that God himself, in the person of Jesus Christ, stepped into this world, took on our humanity, and suffered with us in order to overcome the problem of evil in the world. So God is not just a distant deity who has created this world and left it on its own, but a loving God, a caring God, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. Then there's the question of morality. This could be tied with the other one, but I kept it separately in terms of why should I be good? Why should I obey the laws of the land? If we are purely a product of evolutionary chance, why don't we follow the law of the jungle? Why isn't the survival of the fittest? If that's what we are, if we are evolutionary creatures, then shouldn't we be saying, well, let's stamp out these other races. Let's not care about anybody else. The survival of my genes is what counts. That would be, again, to me, the natural logic of following an atheistic, materialistic worldview. But again, if there is no absolute standard of morality, and if there is no life beyond death, then why should I be good? Why not just eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow I die? Why not just grab everything that I can in this life, even if it means stamping on other people? Now, again, I know that atheists will give answers and say, yes, we need to be considerate. And atheists, they're good, moral people, some of them, many of them maybe, I don't know. But it is possible to be moral without believing in God. But again, it's inconsistent. If you follow the atheistic worldview, you shouldn't be nice to your neighbor. You should stamp on them. You should eat them. But if we are following a Christian worldview, I think Francis Schaeffer made this point many years ago, and there's another guy, Frank Turek, who's recently written a book called Stealing from God. And he says a lot of these other people are taking God's ideas, even the very idea of liberalism, the idea of being compassionate, of socialism. Those ideas really come from a Christian worldview of caring for others, because others are made in the image of God. And other people are inherently valuable because they are human. But that comes from a Christian theistic worldview and not from a pure atheistic worldview. But we know, people know intuitively that certain things are wrong. And Romans chapter 2 tells us the reason why. It's because God has written his law on people's hearts. Even though they try to suppress the truth in unrighteousness, as Romans 1 says, they know that there are certain things that are right and wrong. Again, the story is told of a man who is trying to deny the reality of absolute morals. And this Christian professor said to him, you're telling me that if I was to take a sword and cut up a baby in front of you, that wouldn't be wrong. Now, in his worldview, to be consistent, he would have to say that because he said there's no absolute truth, no absolute morals, and he'd have to say, well, the man said, well, I wouldn't like it, but I couldn't say it's wrong. But we know intuitively in our hearts because God has written his law upon our hearts. And also, and I think this is a powerful argument that we can use, in Romans chapter 2, Paul is saying, as soon as somebody points a finger and says, that's wrong, they are showing that they are moral creatures, that there is a moral law written on their heart. And so if an atheist is telling us that we are wrong because of our view on some sexual morality issue, as soon as they tell me that I'm wrong for holding that view, they are showing that the law of God is written in their hearts. That's what Paul is saying. As soon as we tell somebody else, as soon as I judge someone else, I show that there is a moral law that's active in this world and that it's wrong for me to judge somebody else. But they're judging me for judging somebody else. So we need to understand that question of morality is deeply imprinted upon our hearts. We also know that the Bible consistently promises blessings for obedience and punishment for disobedience. Now, in the Old Testament, that was going to be in this life. I think in the New Testament, that promises for the next life. That if we are good in this life, if we faithfully follow God, he is going to reward us. We are not promised all of the blessings and goodness in this life, but we are promised the blessings for obedience. And the Bible also tells us, and this is what Paul quotes in Acts chapter 17, the Bible tells us that God will judge the world in righteousness by the man he has appointed and given assurance of this by raising him from the dead. And so again, that reality, that there is a judge, that has a powerful influence in my life. I know that one day I'm going to have to stand before God. I know that if I coming up to Kilkenny here this evening, the guards were sitting at the bridge on the motorway with their speed gun, ready to catch anyone speeding. I know if I break the law, I'm going to have to pay the consequences for it. And God has told me that there is a law, that he is the judge, and that one day every man, woman, and child will have to stand before him. And that has a restraining influence in my life. We were working through Romans in our Bible study on Tuesday night down in Waterford, and we were talking about Romans chapter 3 last night. And again, there is that sense where even though people, they might be able to say, okay, I've never killed anybody. If you ask people, are you a good person? They said, oh yeah, I should go to heaven because I've never killed anybody. That's a pretty low standard of morality. But Jesus would say, if you've hated somebody in your heart, you've already committed murder in your heart. It's as though you had actually done the deed because you have thought it. And sometimes we are restrained because of the fear of the consequences in this society. But I think there is an even more powerful fear that comes from knowing that one day I'm going to stand before the judge. Now, again, I rejoice as a Christian to know that my judgment has already taken place and that my judgment was borne by Jesus Christ on the cross. So there's no more judgment for my sin. There will be an evaluation of my service, but my sin has been dealt with once and for all at the cross, and so we can rejoice in that. And then the final of our 5 questions here is the question of destiny. What happens when we die? Again, I was reminded there recently of a time when we were in Bagnallstown. We were handing out tracts, and I came up to these 2 ladies standing on the sidewalk. They had been brushing off the sidewalk. They were standing there chatting, and I had a tract that I handed to them saying, "Where will you spend eternity?" And they looked at each other and said, "We were just talking about that." They had just come from a funeral, and they were wondering, where will we spend eternity? And that is a question that when someone passes from this life, it does raise that question. Now, there are Eastern religions, again, that would tell us that it's all reincarnation and you just keep going round and round and round and come back in a different form. They believe in karma, that if you're bad in this life, you're going to come back in a worse form in the next life. If you're good in that life, you're going to come back. I don't know how you'd be a good cow, but if you're a good cow, you come back as a higher creature. But that's their view of how things go around. But what people are increasingly believing in Ireland, I find, is when you're dead, and that's the end of it. You're buried 6 feet under, and that's the end. Now, unfortunately, there's some Christians who are teaching that as well, and I think it's a real problem. But I think that there is this reality that I'm sure people have said to you, no one has ever come back from the dead to tell us what's beyond the grave. Of course, we do have Lazarus came back from the dead, and Jesus came back from the dead, and we know that in the story of the rich man and Lazarus, or Abraham, Jesus told the story, but Abraham said that if they don't believe the scriptures, they're not going to believe even if someone rises from the dead. And I've said to people, when they've said, no one's ever come back from the dead, I said, well, if I told you I'd come back from the dead, would you believe me? And they said, no. So again, I think that they are looking for a reason not to believe because it's uncomfortable. And for them, it might be a comfort to them. And again, this is where people are choosing their beliefs on the basis of personal preference. It's comforting to think when I die, that's the end of it and I'm not going to be judged. But it gives me no comfort for the death of my parents or the death of my wife or the death of my child if I think that there's nothing beyond. So the Christianity offers hope. It offers hope that the other religions do not offer. And the Bible says concerning the wicked man that God is in none of his thoughts in Psalm 10. He is convinced that God will not require an account of him, and he's happy with that. But the Bible warns us that it is appointed unto men once to die, and after that, the judgment. The Bible promises to those who believe an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled and that fades not away, reserved in heaven for us. And the Bible warns that those whose names are not written in the book of life will be sent into the lake of fire. And so again, the question of destiny, the Bible has a healthy, strong, wonderful view, I think, of these big fundamental questions, existential questions, I think, that are at the very heart of what it means to be human. And so I think we can give a defense for that. I say, if you're dealing with people from a different worldview, you might need to do a little bit of study, read some books about atheism or Islam, if those are the worldviews that you're facing. But I think it's important for us to know our own foundation first and why we can stand firmly on it. Many people will reject a Christian worldview because they simply don't like it. Others have never heard it properly articulated. We have an opportunity to demonstrate that Christianity is superior to any other worldview because it makes sense of the world in which we live and gives us hope beyond the grave. But we also need to understand the worldviews of those with whom we interact most often.